December 17, 1944. A frozen field near Malmedy, Belgium. Master Sergeant William Carter lay face down in the mud, blood pooling beneath his shattered nose, while his 19-year-old son watched from 15 feet away. The German officer's boot came down again, this time on his ribs, and William heard something crack inside his chest. He tried to lift his head, tried to find his son's face in the crowd of captured Americans, but another blow sent him back into the frozen earth. His son, Private First Class Daniel Carter, stood among the other prisoners with his hands raised, tears freezing on his cheeks, screaming words that William could not hear through the ringing in his ears. 2 German soldiers held Daniel back, their rifles pressed against his spine, and William watched his boy struggle against them with the desperate strength of someone watching his father die. The German officer leaned down and spoke in accented English, his voice calm and almost conversational. He told William that American soldiers were weak. He told him that the war was already lost. He told him that his son would watch him bleed out in this field, and then his son would join him. William Carter looked up at the officer, blood dripping from his mouth, and in that moment, something ignited inside him that was stronger than pain, stronger than fear, stronger than the cold that was seeping into his bones. He made a promise to himself, a promise that he would keep, even if it killed him. He was going to survive this, he was going to get his son out, and he was going to come back. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable stories of vengeance and salvation to emerge from the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the courage, the brutality, and the unbreakable bonds that define us as human beings. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and help us keep these memories alive. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how a father and son ended up in that frozen field together. William Carter was born in 1901 in a small farming community outside of Topeka, Kansas. His father had been a wheat farmer, his grandfather had been a wheat farmer, and everyone assumed that William would spend his life the same way, coaxing crops from the stubborn prairie soil and watching the seasons turn in their endless cycle. But William had other ideas. He enlisted in the army in 1919, just weeks after his 18th birthday, drawn by a restlessness that the flat Kansas horizon could not satisfy. The Great War had just ended, and William missed the fighting by months, but he discovered in the army a sense of purpose and belonging that farming had never provided. He was good at soldiering. He was calm under pressure, quick to learn, and possessed of a natural authority that made other men want to follow him. He rose through the ranks slowly but steadily, serving in garrison posts across the country, and by 1925 he had earned his sergeant's stripes. That same year he met a young schoolteacher named Eleanor at a church social in Fort Riley, and within 6 months they were married. Daniel was born in 1925, and from the moment William first held his son, he understood that his life had changed in ways he could not fully articulate. He had always been a serious man, careful with his emotions, but Daniel unlocked something in him that he had not known existed. He found himself laughing at the boy's antics, marveling at his curiosity, feeling a fierce protectiveness that bordered on physical pain. The years that followed were good ones. William continued his army career, moving his family from post to post as assignments required, and Eleanor made each new quarters feel like home. Daniel grew up surrounded by soldiers, absorbing the rhythms and rituals of military life, and by the time he was a teenager, he could field strip a rifle faster than most recruits. William hoped that his son would choose a different path. He had seen enough of war, even from a distance, to know that it was not the adventure that young men imagined. He encouraged Daniel to think about college, about a profession, about building a life that did not depend on the whims of politicians and generals. But when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, William knew that his hopes were futile. Daniel was 16 years old, too young to enlist, but William saw the fire in his son's eyes and recognized it as the same fire that had burned in his own chest 22 years before. He did not try to extinguish it. He knew better than to try. William was 40 years old when the war began, old enough to have avoided combat if he had wanted to, but he did not want to. He requested a transfer to an infantry unit, citing his experience and training, and by the summer of 1942 he was on a ship bound for England. He left Daniel and Eleanor at Fort Benning, Georgia, with promises to write every week and to come home safely. Eleanor held his hand at the train station and told him she loved him. Daniel shook his hand like a man and told him to give the Germans hell. William did not look back as the train pulled away. He was afraid of what his face might show. The years that followed tested William Carter in ways that basic training could never have prepared him for. He landed in North Africa in November of 1942, fought through Tunisia and Sicily, and was among the first American soldiers to set foot on the Italian mainland. He was wounded twice, promoted to Master Sergeant and decorated for bravery under fire. But the thing that kept him going, the thing that pulled him through the darkest nights and the bloodiest battles, was the thought of his son. Daniel turned 18 in 1943, and William received a letter that autumn informing him that his boy had enlisted in the army. The letter was short and matter-of-fact, written in Daniel's neat handwriting, and it said all the things a father dreads to read. Daniel had completed basic training at Fort Benning, the same post where William had left him 2 years before. He had qualified as an expert marksman, had been assigned to an infantry division, and was shipping out for Europe in the spring. William read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, next to the photograph of Eleanor and Daniel that he carried everywhere. He did not cry. He was a soldier, and soldiers did not cry. But that night, he sat alone in his foxhole and prayed to a God he was no longer sure he believed in. He prayed that if one of them had to die, let it be him. William Carter landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, wading through water that was red with blood and stepping over bodies that bobbed in the surf like broken dolls. He was 43 years old, ancient by infantry standards, and more than one young soldier looked at him with the mixture of respect and disbelief that his age and rank commanded. He survived D-Day, he survived the hedgerow fighting that followed. He survived the breakout from Normandy and the race across France. And by December of 1944, he was serving with a unit attached to the 99th Infantry Division, holding a quiet sector of the front near the Belgian-German border. The war seemed almost over. Paris had been liberated. The German army was in retreat. There was talk that the boys might be home by Christmas, and even William, who had learned never to trust optimism in wartime, allowed himself to hope. Then, on December 10, 1944, a replacement soldier arrived at William's unit. William was reviewing supply manifests in a ruined farmhouse when his company commander brought the new man in. The commander was grinning in a way that William found puzzling, and he was about to ask why when the replacement stepped into the light. For a long moment, William could not speak. Daniel stood before him in a private's uniform, thinner than William remembered, with the first shadow of a beard on his jaw and eyes that were older than his 19 years. He was smiling, but there was nervousness in the smile, uncertainty about how his father would react. William crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled his son into an embrace that crushed the breath from both of them. The company commander laughed and left them alone, and for several minutes neither Carter spoke. They simply held each other, father and son, in a bombed-out farmhouse on the edge of a frozen forest, while the war rumbled distantly in the east. When they finally separated, William held Daniel at arm's length and studied him with the critical eye of a soldier assessing a new recruit. Daniel had filled out since the photograph in William's pocket had been taken. His shoulders were broader, his hands calloused from training, and there was a steadiness in his gaze that had not been there before. William asked him how he had managed to get assigned to this unit. Daniel admitted that he had called in every favor he could think of, had written letters to every officer who might remember his father's name, had made himself a nuisance until someone finally agreed to transfer him. He had spent 6 months in a rear echelon unit, pushing papers and counting supplies, and he had hated every minute of it. He had wanted to be with his father. William did not know whether to be proud or terrified. He settled for both. The days that followed were strange ones for William Carter. He had spent 2.5 years fighting this war alone, carrying the weight of command and the burden of survival without anyone who truly knew him. Now his son slept in the foxhole beside him, ate the same cold rations, shivered under the same thin blankets. It was everything William had feared, and everything he had secretly longed for. They talked at night in the quiet hours when the artillery was silent and the forest seemed almost peaceful. Daniel told him about Eleanor, about how she had aged in the years since William left, about how she spent her evenings writing letters to both of them, and her mornings volunteering at the hospital, where wounded soldiers were sent to recover. William told Daniel about the war. Not the heroic version that newspapers printed, but the real war, the one made of mud and blood and the screaming of men who would never go home. He told him because he wanted his son to be prepared, and he told him because he needed someone to know the truth. December 16th, 1944, dawned cold and foggy. William woke to the sound of artillery, closer than it should have been, and within minutes, his world exploded. The Germans had launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, catching the Allied forces completely by surprise. What would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had begun, and William's unit was directly in its path. The fighting that day was chaos. German tanks broke through the American lines like wolves through sheep. Communications failed. Units that had been neighbors for months lost contact with each other and ceased to exist as coherent forces. Men ran, fought, died, and surrendered in a swirling confusion that no one could control. William and Daniel fought side by side through the morning, falling back from position to position as the Germans advanced. William saw his son kill for the first time, watched him shoot a German soldier who had appeared suddenly from behind a burning half-track, and he saw the look on Daniel's face afterward. It was the look of a boy who had just lost something that could never be recovered. By afternoon they were surrounded. Their unit had been cut off from the main American force, pushed into a pocket of resistance that shrank with every passing hour. Ammunition was running low. Half the men were wounded, and the Germans kept coming. The surrender came at dusk. William was not the one who made the decision. A lieutenant, barely older than Daniel, raised a white flag after the last of their ammunition was expended. William wanted to argue, wanted to fight on with bayonets and bare hands, but he looked at his son's exhausted face and knew that surrender was the only way either of them would survive. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The Germans herded them together with other captured Americans, perhaps 200 men in all, and marched them through the night toward a collection point behind the lines. The march was brutal. Men who could not keep up were beaten. Men who fell were left in the snow. William stayed close to Daniel, close enough to catch him if he stumbled, close enough to shield him from the worst of the guards' attention. But he could not shield him from what came next. The collection point was a frozen field near the town of Malmedy, a place that would become infamous in the weeks and months that followed. The Germans had gathered nearly 150 American prisoners there, guarded by SS troops whose black uniforms and death's head insignia marked them as something different from the regular Wehrmacht soldiers. William recognized the danger immediately. The SS were not bound by the same rules as other German units. They had a reputation for brutality that preceded them like a shadow, and the way they looked at the American prisoners made William's blood run cold. He told Daniel to stay quiet, to keep his head down, to do nothing that might attract attention. But attention found them anyway. A German officer was walking through the crowd of prisoners, inspecting them with the casual interest of a man examining livestock at a market. He was tall and thin, with a narrow face and pale eyes that seemed to register nothing but contempt for the men before him. When he reached William, he stopped. The officer said something in German to one of his subordinates, and the subordinate pointed at the chevrons on William's sleeve. Master Sergeant, the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer in the group. The German officer smiled. He asked William, in perfect English, how it felt to lose. William did not respond. He kept his eyes forward, his face blank, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a soldier standing at rest. The officer did not like being ignored. He stepped closer, close enough that William could smell the coffee on his breath, and he asked the question again. William remained silent. What happened next happened very fast. The German officer barked an order, and two soldiers grabbed William by the arms. They dragged him to the front of the prisoner formation, to a clear space where everyone could see, and they threw him to the ground. Daniel screamed and tried to run forward, but other soldiers caught him and held him back. William could hear his son's voice cutting through the cold air, could hear him begging the Germans to stop, could hear the raw terror of a boy watching his father about to be murdered. The beating began. The German officer took his time. He used his fists first, methodical blows to William's face and ribs that were designed to cause maximum pain without killing immediately. Then he switched to his boots, kicking William in the stomach, the back, the legs. William tried to curl into a ball, tried to protect his vital organs, but the blows came from too many directions. Blood filled his mouth. His vision blurred. He could hear Daniel screaming somewhere far away, could hear the other prisoners shouting and cursing and praying. The officer bent down and whispered in William's ear. He told him that this was what Americans deserved. He told him that the master race would sweep the decadent democracies from the earth. He told him that his son would watch him die, and then his son would be next. William looked up at the officer, blood dripping from his mouth, and he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. The officer recoiled as if struck. William did not know why he smiled. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this man, this monster in a uniform, would never understand what it meant to have something worth fighting for. Perhaps it was simply the madness that comes from too much pain. But in that moment, looking into the German officer's pale eyes, William Carter made a decision. He was not going to die in this field. He was not going to let his son die in this field. He was going to survive, and he was going to make this officer pay for every blow. The beating continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the officer stepped back, breathing hard, his uniform spattered with William's blood. He gave an order in German, and the soldiers who had been holding Daniel threw him forward into the mud beside his father. Daniel crawled to William immediately, cradling his father's broken face in his hands, sobbing with the uncontrollable grief of a child. William could barely see through his swollen eyes, but he found his son's face, and he found his voice. He told Daniel to remember this. He told him to remember the officer's face, his voice, the death's head on his collar. He told him that they were going to survive and they were going to come back. Daniel looked at his father with tears streaming down his face, and he nodded. The Germans left them lying in the field while they organized the prisoners for transport. Some of the American soldiers were marched away toward the east. Others were loaded onto trucks, and some, William would learn later, were simply shot where they stood. But William and Daniel were not among the executed. Whether by oversight or twisted mercy, they were loaded onto a truck with a group of wounded prisoners and driven deeper into German-held territory. William slipped in and out of consciousness as the truck bounced along frozen roads, and each time he woke, he found Daniel's hand holding his own. They ended up at a prisoner-of-war camp near Limburg, a place called Stalag Teuthinde, that would become William's home for the next 4 months. But even as he lay on a thin straw mattress in a freezing barracks, his ribs bandaged with strips of torn blanket, William Carter did not forget his promise. He was going to survive, he was going to get his son out, and he was going to come back. Stalag Teuthinde was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, set on a bleak plain that the winter wind swept clean of any warmth or hope. By December of 1944, the camp held nearly 20,000 prisoners of various nationalities, packed together in conditions that grew worse with each passing week. William's injuries were severe: 3 broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, internal bleeding that the camp's overworked doctors could do little to treat. For the first 2 weeks, he was confined to the medical barracks, drifting in and out of a fever that Daniel was convinced would kill him. But William Carter had not survived 2.5 years of combat to die in a German prison camp. He fought the fever the way he had fought everything else in his life, with the stubborn determination of a Kansas farmer who had learned early that the world does not give you anything for free. Daniel stayed with him as much as the guards would allow, bringing him watery soup and the small rations of bread that the Germans distributed, sitting beside his cot and talking to keep him anchored to the living world. Daniel talked about home. He talked about Eleanor, about the small garden she tended behind their quarters at Fort Benning, about the way she hummed while she cooked and the smell of her apple pie cooling on the windowsill. He talked about Kansas, about the wheat fields stretching to the horizon, about summer thunderstorms that rolled across the prairie like the breath of God. He talked because silence felt too much like death. By January, William was strong enough to move to the regular barracks, though his ribs still ached, and his face was a patchwork of yellow and purple bruises. He walked with a limp that would never fully disappear, and he could not take a deep breath without wincing. but he was alive. The camp was a universe unto itself, with its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own daily rhythms. The prisoners organized themselves by nationality and unit, creating small communities within the larger mass of humanity. The Americans stuck together, sharing what little they had, trading cigarettes and rumors, and the desperate hope that liberation would come before starvation. William became a leader among them, not by choice but by necessity. His rank commanded respect, and his age gave him an authority that the younger men craved. They came to him with their problems, their fears, their questions about whether they would ever see home again. He told them what he could. He organized work details to keep the men occupied. He mediated disputes before they could turn violent. And at night, when the despair became too heavy to bear alone, he sat with the men who were falling apart and listened. Daniel watched his father with a mixture of awe and concern. The beating at Malmedy had broken something in William, but it had also forged something new. The quiet farmer's son from Kansas had become something harder, something sharper, something that burned with a cold fire that never went out. At night, when the barracks fell silent, Daniel could see his father staring at the ceiling with eyes that did not blink. He knew what his father was thinking about. The German officer. William never spoke about it directly, but Daniel could see the officer's face reflected in his father's eyes, could feel the weight of unfinished business that hung over them both. The promise William had made in the frozen mud of Malmedy was not forgotten. It was simply waiting. February brought the coldest weather of the winter. Prisoners who had survived months of captivity began to die of exposure and malnutrition, their bodies carried out each morning and stacked like cordwood near the camp gates. The German guards, who had never been kind, grew crueler as news from the front turned against them. The Americans could hear artillery in the distance sometimes, a rumbling that sounded like thunder, but carried with it the promise of approaching armies. The guards heard it too, and their nervous anger made them dangerous. William knew that liberation was coming, but he also knew that it might not come in time. He began to plan. The camp was not escape-proof. William had spent weeks studying the guard rotations, the weak points in the fence, the patterns of searchlights that swept the perimeter at night. He had identified sympathetic guards who could be bribed with cigarettes or food, and he had made contact with a network of French prisoners who had been planning an escape for months. By March, he had assembled a group of 12 Americans, the strongest and most reliable men he could find, who were willing to attempt a breakout. Daniel was among them. William did not want his son involved. He argued, pleaded, and finally ordered Daniel to stay behind where it was safer. But Daniel refused with the same quiet stubbornness that William recognized as his own. If his father was going, Daniel was going. They went over the wall on the night of March 15, 1945. The escape was a chaos of darkness and fear, of running footsteps and shouted German and the crack of rifle fire that split the night like breaking bones. 2 men were shot before they reached the tree line. A third was caught by dogs and dragged back to the camp. But William and Daniel made it. They ran through the forest for hours, stumbling over roots and rocks, their breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the cold air. Behind them they could hear the Germans organizing search parties, could see the beams of flashlights sweeping through the trees. They kept running. Dawn found them hiding in a farmer's barn 5 miles from the camp, buried under hay that smelled of dust and animal warmth. They were exhausted, half frozen, and utterly lost in enemy territory. But they were free. The journey to American lines took 3 weeks. William and Daniel moved at night, hiding during the day in barns, cellars, and the ruins of bombed-out buildings. They ate what they could find: raw potatoes from abandoned fields, bread stolen from unguarded kitchens, water from streams that were just beginning to thaw. William's injuries made the travel agonizing. Each step sent pain shooting through his ribs, and his limp slowed their pace to a crawl. But he refused to stop, refused to rest longer than absolutely necessary, refused to let the German officer win. Daniel became his father's legs when William's own failed him. The boy who had been terrified at Malmedy had been replaced by something harder, someone who could kill a German sentry with a rock and keep walking without looking back. The war had taken William's son and given him back a soldier. They encountered the first American patrol on April 3, 1945. The soldiers almost shot them before realizing they were friendlies. William and Daniel were gaunt, filthy, dressed in a mixture of prison rags and stolen German clothing, and they looked more like ghosts than men. But when William identified himself, when he gave his name and rank and serial number, the patrol leader's eyes went wide. Master Sergeant William Carter had been listed as missing in action since December 17th. The army had assumed he was dead. They were evacuated to a field hospital behind the lines, where doctors examined them with the grim efficiency of men who had seen too many walking corpses to be surprised by anything. William's injuries were treated properly for the first time since Malmedy. Daniel was found to be suffering from malnutrition and frostbite, but was otherwise intact. They spent a week recovering, sleeping in real beds, eating food that did not have to be stolen or scavenged. And then William Carter began asking questions. He wanted to know about the German officer who had beaten him. He wanted to know where the man was now, what unit he commanded, whether he had been captured or killed in the Allied advance. The intelligence officers who debriefed him were initially reluctant to share information. But William was persistent, and his story, when they heard it, moved them in ways they did not expect. The officer's name was Major Heinrich Vogel. He was SS attached to Kampfgruppe Piper, the unit responsible for the Malmedy massacre and dozens of other atrocities committed during the Battle of the Bulge. Vogel had not been captured. He was still fighting, leading the remnants of his unit in a desperate defense of a town called Langerfeld, 30 miles from where William now lay. William Carter sat with that information for one day. Then he went to his commanding officer and made a request. He wanted to return to the front. He wanted to lead a unit against Major Heinrich Vogel. He wanted to be there when the man who had beaten him in front of his son was finally brought to justice. The commanding officer, a colonel named Matthews who had heard William's story from the intelligence officers, looked at the broken man in front of him for a long moment. Then he nodded. William was given command of a reinforced company, nearly 300 men, and assigned to the assault on Langerfeld. The official reason was that he knew the enemy commander's tactics and could provide valuable intelligence. The unofficial reason was that Colonel Matthews believed in the power of vengeance properly directed. Daniel requested permission to join his father's unit. This time, William did not argue. They moved out on April 12, 1945, the day that President Franklin Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia. The men did not know about the president's death yet. They only knew that they were advancing toward a town that the Germans were determined to hold. William Carter rode at the head of the column, his face still bearing the scars of Malmedy, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where smoke rose from burning buildings. He had made a promise in a frozen field 4 months ago. He was about to keep it. The battle for Langerfeld began at dawn on April 14, 1945. The town sat at the junction of 2 roads that the Germans needed to hold if they were to have any hope of retreating in good order. Major Heinrich Vogel had fortified it with everything he had: machine gun nests, anti-tank positions, snipers in the church tower, and the fanatical determination of SS troops who knew that surrender meant war crimes trials and execution. William's company approached from the west, supported by tanks and artillery that pounded the German positions throughout the night. The noise was tremendous, a symphony of destruction that shook the earth and lit the sky with flashes of orange and white. William did not sleep. He stood in the command post studying maps and reports, visualizing the battle that would come with the dawn. He knew that Vogel was in there somewhere, probably in the town's central administrative building, directing the defense with the same cold efficiency he had displayed at Malmedy. Daniel stood beside his father, silent and watchful. When the order came to advance, William Carter led from the front. The assault was brutal. German machine guns cut down the first wave of Americans, who tried to cross the open ground leading to the town. And for a terrible hour, it seemed like the attack might stall entirely. Bodies piled up behind the low stone walls that offered the only cover, and the screams of wounded men mixed with the chatter of automatic fire. But William's company did not break. They pushed forward building by building, room by room, clearing the Germans out with grenades and bayonets and the raw fury of men who had come too far to fail. William was everywhere, directing fire, rallying men who had begun to falter, leading charges into positions that should have been impossible to take. Daniel fought beside him, covering his father's blind spots, putting down German soldiers who tried to flank their position. The boy from Fort Benning who had once dreamed of adventure was gone forever. In his place was a warrior whose hands did not shake and whose eyes did not waver. By noon, the Americans had reached the center of town. The administrative building was a 3-story stone structure with thick walls and narrow windows that had been converted into firing positions. German soldiers defended it with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, and every attempt to breach the entrance was thrown back with heavy casualties. William called for a ceasefire. He walked into the open space in front of the building, alone and unarmed, and he shouted for Major Heinrich Vogel to come out. The firing stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. William stood in the center of the street, surrounded by the bodies of German and American soldiers alike, and he waited. Then the door of the administrative building opened, and Major Heinrich Vogel stepped out. He looked older than William remembered. The month since Malmedy had not been kind to him. His uniform was torn and dirty, his face was gaunt with exhaustion, and there was a wild light in his pale eyes that suggested he knew how this would end. He recognized William immediately. The two men stood facing each other across the rubble-strewn street, and for a moment the war fell away entirely. There were only two men, bound together by a moment of cruelty in a frozen field, standing at the end of a road that had led them both to this place. Vogel spoke first. He asked William if he had come for revenge. William did not answer immediately. He looked at the man who had beaten him nearly to death, who had made his son watch, who had promised that they would both die in that field. He looked at the fear that was beginning to creep into Vogel's eyes, the realization that the roles had been reversed. And then he did something that Vogel did not expect. He offered him the chance to surrender. Vogel stared at him in disbelief. William told him that the war was over, that Hitler was dead or would be soon, that the 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12 years. He told him that there was no glory in dying for a cause that had already lost. He told him that surrender was not weakness, it was the only rational choice left. Vogel's face twisted with contempt. He raised his pistol. The shot came from behind William, from the ruined doorway of a building where Daniel had taken position with a rifle. The bullet struck Vogel in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the pistol clattering to the ground. American soldiers swarmed forward, surrounding the wounded officer, disarming the Germans who had emerged from the building behind him. The battle was over in minutes. William walked to where Vogel lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder and cursing in German. He stood over the man for a long moment, looking down at the face that had haunted his dreams for 4 months. Then he turned to his men and ordered them to get the major medical attention. Vogel was taken prisoner. He would eventually stand trial at Nuremberg for war crimes committed at Malmedy and elsewhere. He would be convicted and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment as part of the post-war amnesties. William Carter did not attend the trial. He had already gotten what he came for. Not revenge, not the satisfaction of watching Vogel die. Something else, something that mattered more. He had kept his promise. He had survived. He had gotten his son out, and he had come back. That was enough. William Carter came home to Kansas in the autumn of 1945 after the war in Europe ended, and his discharge papers were finally processed. Eleanor was waiting for him at the train station, and she looked exactly the way he remembered. A little grayer, a little thinner, but with the same smile that had captured his heart 20 years before. Daniel stood beside her, whole and alive, wearing a civilian suit that looked strange after so many months in uniform. William stepped off the train and walked toward his family, and when Eleanor threw her arms around him, he allowed himself to cry for the first time since the day he was captured. They went home. They rebuilt their lives. It was not easy. William suffered from nightmares for the rest of his life, waking in the small hours of the morning with Vogel's face burning in his mind and the taste of blood in his mouth. Some wounds do not heal, no matter how much time passes. But he learned to live with them. Daniel went to college on the GI Bill, studied engineering, and built a career that took him far from the battlefields of Europe. He married a woman he met at the University of Kansas, had 3 children, and never talked about the war unless someone asked directly. When they did ask, he told them about his father. He told them about the man who had been beaten nearly to death in a frozen field and had refused to die. He told them about the promise made in blood and mud and the promise kept at the end of a rifle. He told them that his father had been offered the chance to kill the man who had tortured him and had chosen instead to give him mercy. He told them that this choice, more than anything else, was what made his father a hero. William Carter died in 1987 at the age of 86, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and the Kansas wheat fields that had watched him grow up. His grave marker bears a simple inscription: Father, Soldier, Man of Honor. Every year on December 17th, the anniversary of Malmedy, Daniel Carter visits his father's grave and stands in silence for a long time. He thinks about the frozen field and the German officer, and the promise made by a broken man who refused to stay broken. He thinks about the 300 Americans who followed his father into Langerfeld, not knowing that they were part of a story that would be passed down through generations. And he thinks about the moment when his father, standing over the man who had tried to destroy him, chose to show mercy instead of vengeance. That choice changed everything. It taught Daniel that strength is not the same as cruelty. It taught him that the measure of a man is not how he treats his friends, but how he treats his enemies. It taught him that even in the darkest moments, there is always a choice. He passed those lessons on to his own children, and they passed them on to theirs. The story of William Carter lives on, not in history books or memorials, but in the hearts of the people who carry his blood and his name. It lives on every time someone chooses mercy over revenge. It lives on every time a father protects his son. It lives on every time someone keeps a promise, no matter the cost. That is the legacy of Malmedy. That is the legacy of a man who came back with 300 soldiers, not to kill, but to prove that he was still alive. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share in the comments what moved you most, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. These stories remind us that even in the worst circumstances, there is always the possibility of courage, of mercy, of hope. Help us keep these memories alive by sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.